The Triumph Scrambler 1200 is undoubtedly one of the best rugged off-road retro bikes on the market, but up until now they have sat a little bit tall in the saddle, which might make them feel a bit of a stretch for shorter riders, and also the pricing is certainly on the premium end, so it's a stretch for the wallet as well as the legs. But new for 2024, Triumph have sought to address both of these issues with a brand new X model, and they've also revised and updated the brilliant XE. So in this video we're going to go through all of the details of each bike and find out, are they still the pinnacle of retro scrambling? But before we get started, a massive thanks to Cardo for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. They make the best motorcycle comm system on the market in my opinion, and we specifically use their range-topping Pack Torque Edge, for which you'll find a 10% discount code down in the description. And it's rammed full of the latest features, but in particular, I've been super impressed with the dynamic mesh communication tech, which means that up to 15 riders can pair with up to a mile between each. I also love that it automatically heals, so if someone drops off, there's no need to manually pair again when they catch back up. And then there's the sound quality. The JBL design speakers are second to none, and the noise gating on the mic is pretty much perfect, so there's no annoying wind noise that makes you want to switch it off. Genuinely, this is the headset I'd want even if they didn't sponsor us, and so I'd thoroughly recommend checking out the link and the discount code down in the description below. So first up, let's take a look at this new X model, which now replaces the XC, and I think in my opinion that brings two benefits. Firstly, the naming convention of the previous generation was a little bit confusing. XC and XE did sound quite familiar, and it was confusing enough for me, let alone the customer. And the other thing is that both the XC and the XE were quite tall bikes. The XC sat at 840mm in the seat height, the XE at 870, and then when you consider that the Scrambler 900 was down at 790mm, there was a bit of a gap in the Scrambler lineup in that sort of seat height range that's normal for most bikes, which is really between 800 and 830. So the big change here with the X model is that it now sits at 820mm, which is far more accessible. That's 20mm down on the XC and 50mm down on the XE. That's going to make it look far more appealing for shorter riders, and also they're not insubstantial bikes. You know, they do have a decent weight to them, and so if you don't feel that confident on tall bikes, you'll definitely want to be able to pretty much get both feet down. For me, I'm around 5'9" or 175cm, and on this bike I can far easier get both feet down than on the XE, where I have to get over to one side of the saddle. But if 820mm still sounds a little bit on the lofty side to you, then the good news is that there's an accessory seat that takes a further 25mm off it. That brings the seat height down to 795mm, which is almost on a par with the Scrambler 900 that I just mentioned. Now the 900 is still a brilliant bike, but there is certainly a trade-off in terms of power and the chassis and the technology, and so for me this X model with the low seat is now a great option if you are a little bit on the shorter side, but you still want the increased capabilities that you get and the looks of the 1200 models. Now on top of all that, the price has actually come down quite considerably on this bike. So whereas the previous gen XC was $12,695 and the XE was $13,695, you're now looking at $11,895 for the X and $13,295 for the XE. So that's 800 quid saved on the X versus the XC, but also 300 quid less on the XE. So the question is, how have they done it? Well, first up, you may notice a bit of a difference in the chassis spec. Firstly, the suspension, which is now from Marzocchi front and rear as opposed to Showa forks and Öhlins shocks on the XC model. Thing is, they try and say that their experience of working with Marzocchi hardware has been excellent, and they've also been able to pretty much mimic the settings and response of the previous suspension, but just been able to deliver it with more affordably priced stuff. Now, naturally, with this bike sitting a little bit lower than the XC, there is a trade-off in terms of suspension travel, so it now gets 170mm front and rear as opposed to 200mm, but still for me that sounds like a reasonable amount, especially if you consider this as primarily a road bike just with a little bit of off-road ability. The XE sits much taller and it gets 250mm of travel, so if you are thinking of dabbling in trail riding, then that's certainly the one to go for. Now braking has also been simplified a little bit, so you've got two-pot Nissin calipers up front here on 310mm discs, this as opposed to the Brembo M50s of the XC and XE, but these look pretty similar to the hardware that you'll find on their 660 lineup of bikes, so the Tiger Sport, the Trident, and I've always thought the braking has been totally up to scratch on those bikes, so hopefully it stands up here as well when we actually get to test one out on the road. Now, one of the other key differences between these two models now is in the cockpit, and we've got a different dash and switchgear, again that looks like it's been carried over from the 660 lineup. So you've got this simpler split round speedo with an inverted LCD at the top for the basic riding information like speed and revs and gear position, and then a smaller 2-inch TFT display at the bottom for all your menus and connectivity. So of course the switchgear is not quite as nice to the touch as the more expensive model, and there is a little bit less screen space with this dash, but having owned a Trident for quite a while and also tested out the Tiger Sport 660 quite extensively, I can say that I really do like this dash. It's very visible and also crams in a heck of a lot of functionality, so I think it'll be perfectly at home here as well. Elsewhere on the bike, when you start to look up close, there is a difference in some of the finishing hardware, so you don't get the handguards as standard, for example. The mudguards are painted plastic as opposed to brushed aluminium. Stuff like the side panel down here is a little bit simpler, and also the foot pegs and foot controls look more basic and less premium. But ultimately, all that stuff helps Triumph to hit this much more tempting price point, and you've still got the great fundamentals on this bike, like the 1200cc Bonneville Parallel Twin. Now, there are a couple of small tweaks to the engine for both bikes for this new model year. So they say a new throttle body and also a revised exhaust system. And while this was already a very punchy and rich engine with a really nice feel and character to it, they actually say this new tune pulls peak torque and peak power down in the rev range by a couple of hundred RPM, and they also claim a broader spread of torquiness across the whole spectrum. So I'd expect these new 2024 models to feel even more satisfying out on the road. The other big benefit of this new exhaust system, they say, is better heat management, which I think will be of great interest to current gen owners. High-level exhausts like this can get pretty warm up against your leg, especially in summer or if you're in slow-moving traffic and you haven't got the wind cooling you down. And I definitely experienced that with the Scrambler 1200 when I borrowed a press bike and rode it for a couple of weeks around London. But apparently these new headers help to minimize heat, and so again, another one to go on the list to check out when I actually get to review one. Now, you still also get this beautiful wheel set on this bike. It's a 21-inch front, a 17 at the rear, and they're spoked. And so the large diameter at the front gives it a little bit more of that off-road ability, but also it really does contribute to the looks. Worth adding that the spokes lace to the edges so it can run tubeless tires, which means far easier repairs for most riders where you can just use a plug. And they're shod with Metzler Karoo street tires, which I think are perfect for this bike because they're really good on the road, but just have that little bit of off-road ability should you want to dabble. Tech is another big strength of this bike, I'd say, despite the retro looks and also this new simpler display, because you still get 5 riding modes, so sport, road, rain, off-road and rider configurable, and within that you've got 3 levels of ABS and 5 levels of traction control. Now both of those rider aids are now lean sensitive, which I believe was previously only on the XE model, and so you could say that's a little bit of an enhancement over the outgoing XC. Then you've also got the option to fit the Bluetooth connectivity module, and that brings loads of features to the small TFT part of the dash here, like call handling, music, turn-by-turn navigation, and also even the ability to control a GoPro from the switchgear. So overall, I think the fundamentals are what makes the Scrambler 1200 appealing, like the looks, the engine, the fairly off-road capable chassis, and also the almost adventure bike levels of tech. You know, they're all still there, but those new seat height options should give it much broader appeal, and also the choice of more affordable componentry in areas where I don't think it'll affect the riding experience of the bike too much have helped them to pull the price down. And for me now, it's a much more clear distinction between the two models as to whether you want the road version or the very capable off-road bias beast. So on to the new XE, and this bike is very similar in many ways with pretty much the same engine, frame, wheels and much of the styling, but that taller suspension gives it far greater ability and clearance for proper off-road obstacles. Now again here for 2024 we've got Marzocchi suspension front and rear, so that should go some way to explain that £300 saving, but hopefully the performance is just as good and you do get a lot more travel on this bike. Like I say, 250mm front and rear, which is pretty much on a par with most middleweight adventure bikes, and it's also worth adding that it's fully adjustable front and rear, so you can really get this one dialed to your specific taste. The X on the other hand gets preload adjustment on the shock, so you can compensate for carrying a passenger and or luggage, but otherwise it's fixed, and perhaps that's to be expected wanted on a bike at a lower price point. Now this bike also gets significantly upgraded brakes versus the X model, so you've now got Brembo style lemmers, which is a slight bump in spec I guess versus the M50s of the previous gen XE. This is really proper top drawer stuff. You'll find these brakes on their Speed Triple and bikes like that, and so it really ought to be more than enough power for a Scrambler. Overall it's just a much bigger feeling bike as well, so like I say, the seat height is 870mm, so it really does feel tall, but you've also got wider handlebars by a good 65mm, so it really does feel quite substantial in comparison to the X. Another key difference is the swing arm. They say it's 32mm longer on this version, and they've done that to give it more stability off-road, whereas the X biases more so towards quicker turning and nimbleness on tarmac. Now on top of that, you've got this better TFT display, which I really like the look of, and also an additional riding mode. So this one gets Off-Road Pro, which allows you to disable more of the rider aids to give you more control off-road. It's worth adding though that both bikes have got rid of their keyless system, which I think might get a bit of a mixed reception. I mean, on the one hand it is a nice convenience, but realistically on bikes like this where the filler cap and the steering lock aren't integrated into it, you end up getting the key out quite often anyway. Plus a regular key kind of does suit the retro nature of these bikes, so for me I'd probably rather save the money on the cost of the bike and just stick with a good old-fashioned ignition key. Now both bikes get a little bit of an update to the styling, and I particularly like this Baja orange split paint job on the XE model, but also the X looks pretty good in the single color, and I really do like that grey and also the red option. Now lighting has also been updated. You now get the slimmer, slightly more modern looking LED indicators. Typically you'll more often see these outside of the modern classic lineup, but to me they look a little bit more sleek. And then they've also slimmed down the tail light, which I think is another welcome change. To me, I think the XE looks like the better out of the two, with the extra detail on the tank, the taller stance, the gold anodized forks, and some of those other touches I mentioned earlier. But looks are always personal taste, so let me know which you pick down in the comments. Now in the press briefing, Triumph were sort of referring to this bike as having adventure bike capabilities, but with cool classic retro looks. And while I would largely agree in terms of having fun on the road and the off-road capability of the XE model, the one area where it does come up a little bit short is sort of touring ability and longer rides. There isn't really much bodywork up at the front here to protect you from the wind, so it is a little bit more tiring for motorway work than something like a Tiger 900. And of course at the rear here you've got the single-sided exhaust, which does limit your potential for luggage carrying. But the thing is, both points have been slightly addressed for this new 2024 model year. Firstly with what they call a Dakar-inspired fly screen to give you a little bit more wind protection, but also there's a new modular luggage system that includes a roll bag, a tank bag, a tail pack, and a single pannier, and that adds up in total to 102 litres of storage space. So look, still not quite full adventure bike capabilities, but if you're thinking about doing a weekend away or two, then both areas to me do look like a really good enhancement. So look, overall it looks like a really nice evolution of these Scrambler 1200 models with some nicely thought out tweaks and changes, but for me it's really this X model that's the main roll of the dice from Triumph to see if they can sell even more of these bikes by broadening its appeal. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of them, so do let me know down in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you've not already if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on YouTube. Many thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next one.